A dog crying drags its owner into a lake. When he decided to dive deep, he was trembling to see what he had found. Bruno walked slowly around Lake Willow, that huge and quiet place he always went to when he needed to think. It was a beautiful lake, with big trees that gave shade, and the water shone with the sun, looking like a giant mirror. But that day, Bruno didn't even notice that. He was sad, with a knot in his heart. As if he had a heavy stone inside him, he had broken up with his girlfriend, and that left him with a bitter feeling, a difficult sadness to explain. As he walked, he noticed that he was lost in his world, you know? Each step made the ground crack with the dry leaves, but Bruno could only think about how everything had changed. Even the lake seemed to understand what he felt. The wind passed gently, moving the leaves from the trees, and made a low sound, like a whisper. It seemed like the lake was telling him, "Everything will be fine, Bruno." But even so, his heart was still heavy. Bruno sighed, breathing in the fresh air, and looked at the sky, where some white clouds were passing slowly. He thought that someday all that sadness would disappear. The only thing that made Bruno feel a little better was being with Tony, his dog. Tony was much more than a dog to him. He was his partner, his friend of all times. Whenever Bruno was sad or discouraged, Tony seemed to know. He brought his hairy snout to Bruno's legs, wagged his tail, and looked at him with those eyes that said, "Hey, I'm here with you." In those days, Tony managed to get Bruno out of the house to take a walk, almost as if he were telling him, "Come on, let's go out for a little air." As much as Bruno didn't feel like it, he ended up leaving, because with Tony, everything seemed lighter. They walked together, and Tony smelled everything. Every little stone, every tree, every leaf that fell to the ground. It was in those walks where Bruno managed to forget a little bit of his sadness. The happy way Tony carried himself made him laugh, even if it was just a little bit, and that already made a big difference. Why? Sometimes, just the fact of having a friend by your side, even if it's a dog, already makes our heart feel less heavy, right? And Tony knew better than anyone. The people around Bruno always said things like, "Get over it now," or "Find another girlfriend." It seemed like nobody understood how he felt inside. It was as if they wanted to press a button and erase their sadness, as if pain was something that could be erased. And with those words, it was as if they tried to prevent Bruno from feeling what he needed to feel. That sadness, that longing, that emptiness that was still there. But Tony was different. He didn't need words to show he understood. Tony didn't push Bruno to keep going. He just stayed by his side in his own way. On the days when Bruno was sadder, Tony just leaned on his legs, lowered his head, and stayed there, as if saying, "I'm with you no matter what." And that silent company, that look full of affection, made Bruno feel that it was right to feel what he felt. In one of those walks, Tony started acting in a very different way. Suddenly, he pulled the leash with a force that Bruno had never felt before. Tony seemed to have decided that he had to go somewhere and did not want to stop. Bruno even tried to hold him back and called him by his name several times, but Tony was determined. And where did he go? To the shore of the lake. Tony looked at the water as if he was seeing something very important there. Before Bruno could understand, Tony jumped into the cold water, swimming non-stop. Bruno was surprised, almost not knowing what to do. Tony had never done anything like that. But there was something in Tony's insistent behavior that made him believe he should follow him. Bruno was a little worried about Tony's actions. After all, he was not just any dog. Tony had served in the army and had faced situations that Bruno could only imagine. Even retired, Tony still had that alert side, as if he were always ready to protect or follow an order. At first, it took him a while to adapt to life more calmly with Bruno. Sometimes, a sudden noise or a stronger voice made Tony react, as if he were back at work, and that worried Bruno. And now, seeing Tony insist so much on getting into the water, Bruno wondered if it was not one of those moments in which his old friend acted instinctively, as if he knew something that Bruno could not see. Tony seemed to have a determination in his gaze, an air of having grasped something important, and he would not rest until he followed it. Bruno, despite the concern, felt that he had to trust Tony. After all, That furry friend knew more about courage and loyalty than anyone he knew. But before continuing, remember to like and subscribe to the channel if you love animals and their exciting stories. As Bruno followed Tony into the waters of Lake Willow, he felt the intense cold enveloping him, making each part of his body shake. The fog was dense, almost magical, dancing on the surface of the water as if it were hiding ancient secrets. The feeling of being in that freezing water with his heart rate soaring made Bruno remember memories he believed had been asleep for a long time. In his mind, he returned to the days of his childhood when he walked along those same shores with his grandfather. Bruno could almost hear his deep and gentle voice telling stories of old adventures, of soldiers who fought bravely, and of treasures that, according to him, could be hidden there in the depths of the lake. This lake is more than just water and stones, Bruno. It has secrets that no one has discovered yet. At that time, I thought it was just another story, something to feed the imagination of a child. But now, there, in the cold waters, Bruno began to see those stories in a different way. I remembered once, especially, when his grandfather pointed to the center of the lake with a serious and mysterious look, saying that, during the Civil War, Confederate soldiers had passed through those lands. Some said they hid gold and other valuable objects so that they were not captured by the enemy. It was as if his grandfather really believed in that legend, and the glow in his eyes made it clear that he felt a deep respect for those stories. While he was swimming, guided by Tony, Bruno felt a wave of nostalgia. He thought about how his grandfather taught him to be curious, not to be afraid to investigate the unknown. Those memories brought a feeling of comfort, as if his grandfather was there, present in spirit, encouraging him to move forward. Bruno knew that maybe that was the opportunity to honor that curiosity and passion that his grandfather had for Lake Willow and its mysteries. With each stroke, it was as if Bruno was swimming not only through the waters of the lake, but also through the waters of his own memories. In the middle of the lake, Tony seemed to have a clear goal in mind. He swam decisively, almost as if he were being guided by something invisible. Bruno still tried to keep up with the pace. He called Tony's name several times, trying to stop him and bring him back to the shore. "Tony, come back here! What are you doing?" Bruno's voice resounded through the lake, but the dog didn't even look back. Tony, with his wet coat shining under the dim light that crossed the fog, swam firmly, determined as if he were on a secret mission. Every time Bruno approached, Tony moved forward more, sinking his head into the water and going deeper and deeper. Bruno, now with his heart racing, thought if Tony was really guided by that instinct trained during his time in the army, that sense of smell to discover something important. The cold wind seemed to intensify as they approached the center of the lake, and the fog became denser, making everything around him even more mysterious. Bruno felt a mixture of fear and adrenaline when realizing that they were going deeper and deeper, and the shore was getting further away. Why is he so focused? Bruno thought, asking if Tony knew something that he hadn't noticed yet. While he was swimming, Bruno couldn't ignore the feeling that something special was about to happen. Tony, without paying attention to any call, continued swimming with that determined look, as if he were responding to an old call, a lake secret that only he could feel. With every meter they covered, Bruno felt that they were closer to discovering something that would change their lives forever. When Tony stopped swimming and floated in the middle of the lake, looking fixedly toward the water, Bruno realized that something was about to happen. He hesitated for a second, looking at Tony, who, although without speaking, seemed to encourage him to move on. Bruno felt that it was time to go beyond what his eyes could see. With one last deep breath, he held his breath and submerged in the dark waters. As soon as he entered the cold water, Bruno felt a chill run through his whole body. The water was icy and dense, and the light that managed to cross the fog made everything around him seem darker and more mysterious. He swam slowly downward, feeling the pressure increase in his ears and his eyes adjusting to the submerged environment where everything seemed wrapped in shadows. Bruno passed through some algae that moved gently, as if they were mysterious hands greeting him, and continued descending. Although his chest began to burn due to the lack of air, suddenly, something hard touched the tip of his fingers. He felt a cold and smooth texture, a metallic material that was partially hidden in the mud. He began to dig with his hands, moving the mud around the object very carefully. With each movement, the shape of the object became clearer. It was something rectangular, heavy, and it had an opaque shine, as if it had been there for a long time. Bruno could not see details, but he knew it wasn't a stone or a simple piece of metal. He continued digging, slowly pulling the object to unearth it. The feeling of having found something so mysterious at the bottom of the lake was surreal, and his heart beat faster than ever, even underwater. Finally, with one last pull, Bruno managed to release the object from the mud. He held it tightly, feeling the weight in his hands, and began to swim upward, moving his legs and arms with force to return to the surface before he ran out of air. When he finally emerged, breathing with difficulty, he felt as if he had just woken up from a strange dream. At that moment, as he regained his breath and looked at the object in his hands, Bruno realized that he had discovered something very special and mysterious. Something that seemed to have waited for him for a long time. Bruno held the object with trembling hands, still trying to recover his breath after that intense immersion. The first thing he noticed was the weight. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, which indicated that it was not something common. He passed his fingers over the surface, feeling the texture of the cold and smooth metal. Carefully, he rubbed the mud that was still stuck on the edges, revealing a golden color underneath the dirt. It was as if an ancient and almost extinguished glow began to emerge, like a treasure emerging from the depths of time. While he was cleaning it a little more, he noticed that the box had intricate details on the sides. They looked like hand-engraved marks, symbols that he could not decipher, but certainly were not common. There were curves, lines, and small drawings, almost like an old code that seemed to tell a story that only that box knew. Bruno turned the object in his hands, and as he removed more mud, he realized that it was not only gold, it was real gold. Could it be that he was really holding a box of gold? He immediately remembered the stories his grandfather told about hidden treasures and ancient legends. Perhaps this box was one of those relics his grandfather spoke about with such enthusiasm, one that Confederate soldiers had hidden so that no one would ever find it. He examined a small latch on the front of the box, but it was rusted and seemed very firm, as if it had been sealed for many years. Bruno wondered what could be inside the box. It could be an old object, or maybe something much more valuable, perhaps documents, old coins, or even a war secret. Bruno's mind was racing, thinking about all the possibilities, and he felt a mixture of emotion and nervousness. While he was holding that box, he realized how extraordinary that discovery was. It wasn't just a piece of shiny metal, it was a piece of history, a relic that for some reason was destined to be found by him. With the gold box in his hands, Bruno could not stop thinking about the old stories he heard during his childhood. Legends that his grandfather shared with such passion that made Bruno's eyes shine with curiosity. One of the stories that he liked the most was about Confederate soldiers who, during the American Civil War, passed through those lands, fleeing from their enemies. To protect their riches from being confiscated, they would have hidden chests of gold and valuable objects in secret places, lakes, caves, and deep forests. Lake Willow, in particular, was mentioned in one of the most mysterious stories. They said that a small group of soldiers, in the middle of the night, and under the starlight, hid a treasure in the dark waters of the lake so that it would not be found. These men swore to keep the secret forever, taking with them the exact location of the gold. Some people even said that, on foggy nights, it was possible to see shadows wandering along the shore of the lake, as if they were the spirits of those soldiers, still protecting their lost treasure. These stories were known among the oldest residents, and many considered them just stories told by grandparents to scare children. But there, with the gold box in his hands, Bruno began to believe that there was more truth in those legends than he imagined. It was as if fate had placed Tony in that exact spot at that perfect moment to unravel a mystery that had been hidden for generations. The feeling of being in the middle of a living legend filled Bruno with silent pride, almost as if now he were part of that story. He felt that somehow the mission of those soldiers to hide the gold was now in their hands, but with a different purpose. The words of his grandfather resonated in his mind. Those places have secrets that no one knows, and maybe someday you will discover them. At that moment, Bruno understood that he had found something that was not just gold. It was a connection with the past, a story that seemed to have waited all his life to be revealed. After spending hours examining the gold box and reflecting on the legends of Lake Willow, Bruno knew that he could not keep it to himself. He felt that the discovery was not just a personal treasure. It was an important piece of history, something that the whole city and perhaps even the country should know. Despite feeling a special attachment to the box and the mystery it enclosed, he knew that the right thing to do was to inform the authorities about what he had found. The next day, Bruno went to the historical department of the city. He held the box very carefully, as if it were a fragile piece of an old puzzle. When he finally found someone on the team, his eyes shone as he showed the object and told the story behind his discovery. The historians were surprised and, at the same time, excited about the possibility that Bruno had found a true treasure from the American Civil War. They decided that the box was worth being examined more thoroughly, and possibly the lake could contain more hidden secrets. In a few days, a team of archaeologists was called to explore Lake Willow. They arrived with sophisticated equipment, diving suits, submarine excavators, and detailed maps, prepared to explore the bottom of the lake in search of clues about the past. The city was excited, and many local residents approached the lake to closely observe the activity. Intrigued by the possibility that there were other historical relics there, the team began to set up a temporary base on the shores of the lake. There were tents with computers, underwater cameras, and a small study area where everything they found would be examined. The archaeologists dived, each with a specific mission, while others carefully observed the images transmitted by the cameras. Each piece of mud, each stone, and each submerged object was treated as an important piece of the puzzle. For his part, Bruno felt as if he were in the middle of a dream. He watched closely, following every immersion, every discovery, with his heart beating fast. He felt that all of this was bigger than he could imagine, as if he had awakened a sleeping story that was now being told to the world. Suddenly, Bruno realized that all the sadness and anguish he had been carrying seemed to have decreased. He was there, watching the team of archaeologists and all the movement around the lake. And he felt something different. It was as if that weight that oppressed his heart had been dissolved a little, replaced by a feeling of emotion and purpose. He looked at Tony, who was observing the activity with his tongue out and his tail wagging, and smiled. People who don't have animals may not understand it, but every walk with our dogs is much more than a simple walk, right? It's not just going out, taking a walk, and coming back. It's like opening a door to a new world, full of adventures. At each step, they show us how the world is full of mysteries, as if we could discover something incredible in any place. With Tony, each walk was an invitation to something special, and Bruno knew that if it weren't for his faithful friend, he would never have lived that experience. After all, it wasn't just a walk. For them, it was always an adventure, one that had now become the greatest discovery of his life. With the news of Bruno's discovery spreading around the city, soon the story began to gain proportions that he never imagined. Journalists, photographers, and curious people began to gather around Lake Willow, all wanting to see the place where the mysterious treasure was found. Reporters held microphones, cameras recorded every detail, and the lake, previously quiet and peaceful, was now full of voices and flashes of camera. Bruno, a little embarrassed by all the attention, was invited to give interviews and share the story of how his dog, Tony, led him to the discovery, praising him for his discovery and adventurous spirit. For Bruno, it was a strange feeling to be the center of attention, but he was also proud. He felt that, in some way, his grandfather was present, seeing everything from somewhere and smiling for having found, at last, something so special. While the gold was studied and catalogued by the experts, the whole city was united around that discovery. Local schools brought groups of children to learn about history and archaeology, and Lake Willow began to be seen not only as a beautiful place, but as a place full of meaning. Bruno felt inspired and grateful, knowing that the treasure that Tony found had the power to bring people together, teach about the past, and make the whole city dream a little more. With the success of the excavations and the historical recognition of the discovery, the authorities decided to reward Bruno for his crucial role. He received a small portion of the gold found, a significant reward that would change his life. Bruno was surprised and excited by the news, but when he looked at Tony by his side, he knew exactly how he wanted to use that gift. The first idea that came to mind was to preserve Lake Willow, that magical place that had been part of his childhood and that now held the history of his discovery. He decided to create an organization to protect the lake and nature around it, ensuring that the space remained intact and cared for future generations. He wanted children, just like him, to one day be able to listen to the stories of the lake and explore that environment full of legends and mysteries. But Bruno also knew that he needed to do something special to honor Tony, his faithful friend, who was truly responsible for all of this. With part of the money, he decided to found a shelter for abandoned animals. He wanted to create a safe place where dogs and cats, without anyone to take care of them, could find love and companionship. This shelter would be a place where animals would be treated with respect and affection, where they would have an opportunity to find loving homes, just as Tony found a home with him. The shelter was called Friends of the Lake, in honor of the place where it all began. And so, Bruno transformed his journey of sadness into a mission of purpose. Every time he looked at the lake and saw children running around, or saw the shelter with dogs and happy cats, he felt that he had found more than a treasure of gold. He had found a way to make a difference, to return to the world the love and hope that Tony had given him. Thank you very much for watching the video until the end. Remember to like it, subscribe to the channel, and leave your comment saying what you thought of this story.